Hi everyone, I'm going to be reading some of Lisa Thompson's new book, The Graveyard Riddle. Lisa Thompson has written Goldfish Boy and several other books as well. So if you haven't already read Goldfish Boy, I strongly recommend it. This book actually has some of the characters from Goldfish Boy in it as well. So I'll give you a bit of a background to the book. So an old abandoned house hides a secret within its walls. When Melody Bird meets a mysterious Hal, he tells her he's an undercover spy, keeping tabs on a gang of jewel thieves. But can a young boy really be in charge of such a dangerous mission? Melody is determined to decode the strange riddles hidden in the graveyard, but Matthew and Jake wonder whether Hal is the true puzzle to be solved. It's a bit of a mystery story, this one. So chapter 1, every chapter as well, it starts with a gravestone. Frankie is a conker brown dachshund and a very wise little dog. For example, I take him for a walk every day after school and at weekends, and he always turns left out of our driveway. He knows exactly which way to go. The graveyard. This afternoon was like any other. We curved around the semicircle of houses at the bottom of Chestnut Close and came to an alleyway. Frankie stopped to sniff at a patch of weeds. Sometimes I wondered if he was actually smelling something good or pretending so that he could have a rest. His legs were really little after all. "Come on, Frankie, let's go," I said. He shook himself and we set off again. Some people thought I was weird because I liked going to the graveyard. To them, a graveyard is creepy. It makes them think of spooky things like rotten corpses and wailing ghosts. I don't feel like that at all. To me, it's full of colour and light and wildlife. In fact, it's probably my favourite place in the world. Very strange, isn't it, that a graveyard is their favourite place in the world? We came out of the alleyway and I took a long, deep breath. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, making a soft shh sound as warm yellow dots of sunlight danced across the headstones. That's really lovely, isn't it? Sunlight dancing across the headstones. When Dad lived with us, I used to go to the graveyard when he and Mum started arguing. There was no shouting there. It was always peaceful. As we walked along the pathway, Frankie stopped in mid-trot and began to sniff at the air. His long brown ears flapped gently in the wind as he searched for the scent he'd picked up. "What is it, Frankie?" I said. "Can you smell the souls of the dead people?" I looked down at the headstone beside it. It read, "Benjamin Henry Brady, born 31st of July, 1884, died 27th of January, 1954. Frankie's wet brown nose wriggled. I knew that a dog's sense of smell was 40 times stronger than ours. Could Frankie smell Benjamin Brady's aftershave still lingering in the air? He sniffed a few more times and then pulled on his lead. He was ready to carry on. We passed the large oak tree which had a circular bench around its trunk and the rusty tap where visitors could fill their watering cans. We usually stayed on the main pathway, headed towards the church and then took a loop back to where we started. But just past the tap I spotted a track we hadn't used for a while. It was overgrown with a tangle of ivy and brambles and led to the oldest part of the graveyard. No mourners had visited that part anymore. They were all dead and buried themselves. "Let's go this way for a change, shall we, Frankie?" I said. My little dog sat down on the pathway, confused that we weren't going our usual route. "Come on, it's not far," I said. The track soon became thick with weeds and I had to trample them down so that we could get through. Surrounding us were ancient headstones, peeking at us through the undergrowth, like grey ships bobbing on a sea of green. Some were speckled with bright splashes of orange lichen, as though they'd been splattered with paint. I carried on walking, but a vicious-looking bramble caught my ankle. It drew blood and I took a tissue out of my school blazer pocket and pressed it against the scratch. After a few seconds it stopped. Frankie sneezed. He was almost buried in weeds. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all," I said. "Come on, let's head back." I scooped Frankie under my arm, stood up and then stopped. Beyond the track was an old red brick wall which circled the perimeter of the graveyard. Part of the wall had crumbled away and there was now a V-shaped gap in the middle. I didn't remember noticing that before. "Wonder what's through there," I said. "What do you think could be through there?" I took a few careful steps, checking for more brambles and crushing any nettles underfoot. The pathway stopped, so I had to walk in between the actual graves where the ground was uneven. When we got to the crumbling wall, I put Frankie down. He gave himself a shake and sniffed at the air. Through the gap I could make out some windows and a door. "It's a house," I said. We scrambled over the pile of bricks and found ourselves in knee-deep grass. In front of us was a cottage. It had a crooked doorway in the centre with 4 small black frame windows, a wonky roof and a chimney. It looked a bit like a toddler's painting of a house. The once white walls were now dirty grey with patches of green, slimy moss. The roof had missing tiles and a deep overhang that almost hid the windows. It must be very dark inside. Beyond the house was another brick wall. It was as if it had been deliberately hidden from view. "Isn't it incredible, Frankie?" I said. "I never knew this was here. A secret house!" Frankie was busy snuffling around at all the new smells. I waded through the grass and peered through the downstairs window. The glass was cracked in the corner and thick with dirt, as though a curtain had been drawn on the inside. Frankie began to pull on his lead. A blackbird was stabbing at a patch of soil with its bright orange beak. It stopped to watch us for a few seconds, then carried on, deciding that we were not much of a threat. The door to the house was dark green and slightly ajar. I hesitated for a second and gave the door a nudge with my knee. It didn't move. I leaned my shoulder against it and shoved hard a few times. Very slowly the door inched open until there was enough space to squeeze through. I peered inside. There was no way anyone was living here. Surely there was no harm in taking a look. Do you think you would go inside an abandoned house? In a graveyard? "Come on," I said to Frankie. "Let's go inside." We walked into a small square room with a low ceiling. It was dark and I had to wait for my eyes to adjust to the gloom before I looked around. The room was empty apart from an open fireplace filled with rubble and a wooden chair covered with a thick layer of dust. It smelled musty and damp, a bit like the smell in our kitchen cupboard underneath our sink. "Wow," I said, turning around. "I wonder how long it's been since anyone lived here." Frankie sniffed at the dusty wooden floor and sneezed. Against a wall was a wooden staircase with no handrail and a lot of missing steps. "I guess we won't be going up there any time soon," I said. I could just make out 2 doorways at the top. There was another room downstairs and Frankie pulled me towards it. This room was much the same, dusty, dark and very bare. I walked over to the window. On the windowsill was a round pebble. I picked it up. It was cold and smooth like a tiny egg. "I wonder where this came from," I said. I put it back, then wiped a small clean circle in the dirty glass with my hand. Through it I could see the gap in the crumbling wall, the tops of the headstones and the newer graves near the main pathway. "I can't wait to tell Matthew about this place," I said to Frankie. "I bet he never knew this was here either." Matthew Corbin was my best friend and lived in the house opposite mine on Chestnut Close. For anyone that has read Goldfish Boy, Matthew is the main character in Goldfish Boy. I checked my watch and decided to head home as Mum would have dinner ready soon. I turned to go when I heard something, a slow creaking noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone was moving very carefully across the floorboards. I looked up at the ceiling, listening hard. "Oh, do you think anyone could actually be inside that house?" "I think there's somebody upstairs," I whispered. I held tightly onto Frankie's lead and we walked slowly back to the first room and towards the broken stairs. I peered up, terrified that a face might suddenly appear at the top. The creaking sound stopped. Hello, I called. "Is someone there?" I listened, but there was no reply. All I could hear was the breeze rustling through the long grass outside. "That must have been it, the wind blowing through the cracks in the windows, making the floorboards creak," Frankie growled. "There's nothing there, Frankie. It's just the wind," I said. "Come on, let's go." I hurried back to the door and we squeezed through the gap. When we were out in the long grass, I turned and tugged on the door to try and shut it, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I spotted something across the top of the doorway. I took a step back. There were words scratched into the dark wood. I felt a shiver tingle down my spine to the soles of my feet as I read what it said. "Lord, have mercy upon us." I wonder what's going to happen next. Have a little think. What do you think is going to happen next? For anyone that does want to read the book, it's called The Graveyard Riddle by Lisa Thompson. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you read Goldfish Boy. It's one of my favourite books. Thank you for listening, guys. See you soon.